Hello friends, welcome to another spine-chilling tale that will leave you questioning what's real and what's not. In this story, we'll follow a lone traveler on a dark, desolate highway. What starts as a routine drive quickly turns into a nightmarish encounter with the unknown. Strange hitchhikers, eerie coincidences, and a sense of dread that refuses to let go. What's really lurking in the shadows? Stick around, because this is a story you don't want to miss. I took Highway 61 south that night, a long stretch of cracked pavement cutting through the rural Midwest. The road seemed endless, with no sign of life except for the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. It felt isolated, like it existed in its own pocket of silence, far away from the rest of the world. It was the kind of road where gas stations are spaced 50 miles apart, and even those feel like relics of a forgotten time. The desolation crept into everything, leaving nothing but the hum of the engine and the faint glow of headlights cutting through the dark. The radio had given up on me about 10 minutes into the drive, leaving only static. I didn't bother scanning for another station. I knew there wouldn't be one. The quiet felt heavier with each passing mile, settling into the car like an unwanted passenger. I was heading back to my hometown in Kansas to visit my mother. She'd had another fall, the kind of call that makes your heart sink no matter how much you try to tell yourself it's nothing. Her voice on the phone, thin and frail, echoed in my head, "Don't worry, honey. It's not serious." But I could hear the exhaustion behind her words, the way she tried to downplay her struggles. The air that night was thick and oppressive, clinging to my skin and pressing into the car as if trying to squeeze me out. The only light came from my headlights, casting long, shaky beams through the empty road ahead. I cracked the window open, hoping the rush of cool air would keep me awake. Around 1 a.m., I noticed something unusual. Two figures were standing on the shoulder of the road, their thumbs out. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The darkness played tricks on tired eyes, and I had been driving for hours. The sight of them jarred me. I don't pick up hitchhikers. It's a rule I've always lived by. Too many stories, too many warnings, and an instinctive wariness kept me from stopping. But these two were different. Something about them made me hesitate. As my car drew closer, I could make out their silhouettes more clearly. There was a man and a woman. The woman appeared young, probably in her early 20s. Her stringy hair glinted faintly in the beams of my headlights, hanging in limp strands that barely moved with the breeze. The man, however, had an unsettling presence. He looked older, his frame thin and wiry, like he hadn't eaten in days. His face was gaunt, sharp angles creating deep shadows that made him look almost skeletal. I slowed down, not intending to stop but just to get a better look. Something about them felt off. The way they stood, too still, as if waiting for something, or someone. The woman's eyes caught mine through the windshield. They were wide and hollow, staring directly at me with a vacant intensity that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a look of desperation or hope, it was something far more unnerving. The man didn't meet my gaze. He just stood there, motionless, staring into the dark abyss of the road ahead. His stillness unnerved me more than her hollow stare. He seemed detached, as if he didn't care whether I stopped or not. A strange, primal unease began to build in my chest. My instinct screamed at me to keep going, to leave them behind. My foot pressed down on the accelerator without conscious thought, and I sped past them. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, their figures faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Yet, their faces remained vivid in my mind. The woman's lifeless eyes. The man's eerie indifference. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just hitchhikers on an empty road. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. 20 miles down the road, I finally saw a gas station. It appeared out of the darkness like a faint beacon, its flickering light struggling against the oppressive night. It wasn't much, just a single pump in a small, worn-out building with grime-covered windows. The kind of place that felt like it belonged to another era, untouched by time but forgotten by progress. Relieved, I pulled into the station and parked by the pump. My hands were still gripping the wheel tightly, my knuckles pale from the tension of the drive. I forced myself to let go and take a deep breath. The air outside was heavy, still carrying that unsettling thickness. As I stepped out of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The attendant sat inside the tiny building behind the counter, his face illuminated by the pale glow of an old black and white TV. He looked disinterested, barely glancing up as I entered. I paid for gas and grabbed a cup of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting there for hours. The bitter smell filled my nostrils, but I didn't care. It was something to keep me awake. Walking back to my car, I tried to push the memory of the hitchhikers from my mind. The rational part of me wanted to believe they were just regular people, nothing more. But I couldn't convince myself. That's when I noticed it. At the edge of the gas station lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, stood two figures. My breath caught in my throat. It was them, the hitchhikers. The woman and the man were standing there, still as statues, their faces shrouded in shadow. They hadn't been there when I pulled in. I was sure of it. My pulse quickened, and my hands tightened around the coffee cup as I froze in place. I glanced back at the gas station attendant, hoping he'd notice them too. But when I looked through the window, the stool behind the counter was empty. Panic surged through me. I hurried to my car, spilling some coffee in the process. My hands shook as I fumbled to unlock the door and slide inside. Once in, I locked the doors immediately and gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of them. They hadn't moved. They were still standing there, watching, their eyes unblinking. The woman's gaze seemed to pierce through the glass, and for a moment, I thought I saw her lips curl into the faintest smile. I slammed the car into gear and pulled away, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the sound of the engine. As I drove off, I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the mirror. They were still standing there, their figures growing smaller as the distance between us widened. Every instinct in my body told me to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between me and that gas station. But no matter how far I drove, the image of their faces lingered in my mind. The hollow eyes, the eerie stillness, it was burned into my memory. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was wrong, and deep down, I knew this night was far from over. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than before. The air in the car felt heavier now, pressing against my chest with each passing mile. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind wouldn't let go of the image of the hitchhikers. The woman's hollow eyes, the man's unnerving stillness, they lingered, etched into my thoughts. The highway was empty, a long ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching endlessly into the night. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to twitch, every flicker of my headlights felt like it illuminated something lurking just out of reach. 15 minutes later, I told myself to calm down. I was letting exhaustion and imagination get the best of me. It had to be that, there was no other explanation. But then, I saw them again. My headlights swept over two figures standing on the shoulder of the road, exactly as they had been before. My breath caught in my throat. It was them, the same man and woman, the same eerie stillness. I slowed down instinctively, but my stomach churned with dread. This wasn't possible. There were no side roads, no shortcuts they could have taken to get ahead of me. And yet, there they were, as if they had been waiting for me. I sped up again, my heart hammering in my chest. As I passed them, I couldn't help but glance at the woman. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and empty, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The man still didn't look at me. He just stood there, staring off into the dark. But this time, I noticed something else. His lips were curved into a thin, crooked smile. I pressed the gas pedal harder, desperate to put distance between us. The car's engine roared as the speedometer climbed, but the fear inside me didn't subside. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them chasing after me. But the road behind me was empty, swallowed by the darkness. The further I drove, the worse the unease became. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe the exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They were real. I had seen them twice now, and there was no mistaking the cold, unnatural presence they carried. The shadows seemed to stretch further across the road as I drove, twisting into shapes that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the interplay of light and exhaustion. About 10 minutes later, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Up ahead, illuminated by my headlights, with a faint glow of taillights. Relief washed over me. Another car. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't the only one on this desolate stretch of highway. As I approached, I realized the car was parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking rhythmically. The orange glow cut through the darkness, pulsing like a heartbeat. I slowed down, hesitating. Maybe someone needed help. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to keep going. And then, I saw them again. The hitchhikers were standing beside the car, talking to the driver. The man stood still, his long coat fluttering in the wind. The woman leaned closer to the driver, her face unnervingly calm. As I drove past, the driver looked up at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide and desperate. For a fleeting moment, I thought he was pleading for help. But before I could react, the man lunged for him, dragging him out of the car and into the shadows. I didn't stop. My foot slammed on the gas, and the car surged forward, leaving the scene behind me. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it was echoing through the cabin. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that I'd done the right thing. There was no way I could have helped, not against whatever those hitchhikers were. But the driver's face stayed with me. Those wide, pleading eyes haunted me as I sped down the highway. I couldn't shake the image of him being dragged into the darkness. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them again. The thought made my stomach twist, but the road behind me remained empty. The night seemed darker now, the blackness pressing against the car windows like it wanted to seep inside. Every flicker of my headlights felt like it was catching movement, but nothing was there. I told myself to focus, to keep driving. The next town wasn't far, I just needed to reach it. But my hands were still trembling, and I could barely keep the car steady. As the road stretched on, my mind kept replaying the scene, the hitchhikers, the driver, the man lunging. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew it had happened. The terror in the driver's eyes had been too vivid, too raw to be a figment of my imagination. Minutes felt like hours as I drove, the highway stretching endlessly ahead of me. I kept telling myself I'd be safe once I reached the next town. Then, a sound broke the silence inside the car, a faint, rhythmic thump. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was coming from the trunk. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the car creaking from the speed. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was inside. Panic gripped me as I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The trunk was locked. It had to be locked. There was no way anyone could be in there. But the thumping continued, each impact vibrating through the car. My breath quickened as I debated whether to stop and check. No. Stopping wasn't an option. I couldn't bring myself to pull over, not with the memory of those hitchhikers fresh in my mind. Instead, I pressed harder on the gas, hoping the noise would stop on its own. But it didn't. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was in the trunk wanted to get out. Suddenly, the car jolted, as if I'd hit something. My stomach dropped, and I fought to keep the vehicle steady. But when I looked in the mirrors, the road behind me was empty. I tried to calm myself, muttering under my breath, "It's just in your head. You're tired. That's all." But the words did nothing to ease the dread curling in my chest. Finally, I saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, a town. Relief flooded me as I realized I was almost there. Just a few more miles, and I'd be safe. The thumping in the trunk stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its place. My skin prickled as I wondered if that was a good sign, or a very, very bad one. As I pulled into the outskirts of town, the streets were eerily empty. The buildings loomed in the faint light, their windows dark and unwelcoming. I parked outside a diner, hands still shaking as I killed the engine. I sat there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the windshield. I didn't want to get out. I didn't want to face whatever might still be following me. But I couldn't sit there forever. I stumbled out of the car, my legs shaky beneath me. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a pale light that flickered as though it could go out at any moment. The air was cold, biting against my skin. I wrapped my arms around myself, glancing around the empty parking lot. It felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The windows of the diner were fogged up, and I could barely make out the shapes of a few people inside. That was a good sign, I thought. People. Witnesses. Safety. I hurried to the door, the soles of my shoes scraping against the cracked asphalt. My fingers trembled as I gripped the handle and pushed it open, the small bell above jingling faintly. Warm air and the smell of coffee and fried food hit me. For a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. The soft murmur of voices and the clink of cutlery on plates were grounding. The waitress behind the counter looked up as I entered. She was middle-aged, with tired eyes and a warm smile that faded when she saw my face. "You okay, hon?" she asked, her brow furrowing. I tried to answer, but my throat felt tight. The words caught, and I could only nod as I made my way to the counter. I sat on a stool, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as if letting go would cause me to collapse. My heart was still racing, my breath uneven. The waitress placed a cup of coffee in front of me without asking. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, trying to steady myself. "Call the police," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. "What happened?" she asked, her tone serious now. The murmur of the other customers quieted as they noticed my state. "There were these people," I said, my voice shaking. "On the highway. Hitchhikers. They weren't normal." Her expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "What do you mean, not normal?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head, struggling to find the right words. "They followed me. They were there, and then, gone. They hurt someone." She exchanged a glance with the short-order cook behind the counter, who had stopped flipping pancakes to listen. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again. I nodded quickly. "Please, just call the police," I said, my voice rising. "You have to check the highway. There was a car, someone was in trouble." The waitress hesitated for a moment before grabbing the phone. She dialed, speaking in hushed tones as she glanced at me every so often. I could feel the other patrons watching me. A man in a trucker cap sitting at the far end of the counter muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. The coffee felt bitter and scalding as I took a sip, but it steadied my nerves slightly. I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see the hitchhikers standing there, watching. The waitress hung up the phone and returned, her expression grim. "They're sending someone to check it out," she said. "But you might want to stick around for a bit." I nodded, grateful to stay in the warm, well-lit diner for a little longer. The thought of going back out there, onto that dark road, made my stomach churn. I sat there in silence, staring into my coffee, trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew I wasn't safe yet. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the diner's dim interior. 2 officers stepped inside, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor. I stood as they approached, my knees weak beneath me. One was a younger man, clean-shaven and alert. The other was older, his face lined with years of experience. "You're the one who called?" the older officer asked, his tone steady but curious. I nodded, clutching my coffee cup like a lifeline. "Tell us what happened," he said, pulling out a small notepad. The younger officer stood slightly behind him, watching me closely. I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. "I was driving down Highway 61, I began, my voice shaky. I saw these hitchhikers. A man and a woman." The older officer raised an eyebrow. "Hitchhikers," he repeated, scribbling something down. I nodded quickly, the words tumbling out of me now. "They looked strange," I said. "The woman's eyes, they were hollow, like she wasn't really there. And the man, he didn't look right either." He smiled at me. The younger officer tilted his head, exchanging a glance with his partner. "Did they do anything to you?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not to me," I said. "But I saw them later. They were standing by another car, talking to the driver. Then the man, he dragged the driver out." The older officer's pen paused on the page. "Dragged him out," he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Yes," I insisted, my voice rising. "He pulled him into the dark. I didn't stop. I didn't know what to do." The younger officer took a step closer, his gaze narrowing. "And where exactly did this happen?" he asked. "About 20 miles back," I said, pointing in the direction I'd come from. "Near a bend in the road. There was a car with its hazards on." The older officer closed his notepad, slipping it into his pocket. "All right," he said, his tone calm but dismissive. "We'll take a look." "Take a look?" I echoed, frustration bubbling up. "You don't believe me, do you?" The older officer gave me a tired smile. "We'll check it out," he said, as if he'd heard stories like mine 100 times before. The younger officer stayed quiet, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned to follow his partner. As they walked back to their cruiser, I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. I wanted to believe they'd find something, anything, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I watched through the diner window as their car pulled out onto the highway, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. The waitress approached me again, her voice soft. "They'll check it out, sweetheart," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I nodded, but her words didn't comfort me. Deep down, I knew I wouldn't feel safe until I knew for sure what was out there, or if those hitchhikers were still roaming the night. Sitting back down, I realized my hands were still trembling. The other patrons returned to their conversations, but the air in the diner felt heavy, like everyone was still on edge. I sipped my coffee, my mind racing with possibilities. What if the police didn't find anything? Or worse, what if they did? I sat in the diner for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, and I hadn't taken another sip. My mind replayed everything I'd seen, over and over. The image of the hitchhikers, her hollow eyes and his unsettling stillness, was burned into my memory. Every time I blinked, I saw them again, standing just beyond the edge of the light. The diner had quieted down. Most of the patrons had left, leaving just me, the waitress, and a lone man hunched over a plate of eggs in the corner booth. I glanced at the clock above the counter. The red hands seemed to move slower than they should, each tick echoing in the otherwise silent room. I tried to tell myself the police would find something. That their headlights would catch the hitchhikers, or they'd spot the abandoned car with the driver still inside. But what if they didn't? What if those people, or whatever they were, had vanished as quickly as they appeared? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The waitress interrupted my thoughts, refilling my cup with a small smile. "Everything okay, hon?" she asked, her voice soft. I forced a nod, not trusting myself to speak. My throat felt tight, and my words seemed trapped somewhere between fear and disbelief. The door jingled as it opened, and my heart leapt. I turned quickly, half expecting to see the hitchhikers standing there. But it was just a young couple, laughing quietly as they took a booth. I let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish for my paranoia. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even here in the safety of the diner. I glanced out the window again. The darkness pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable. The parking lot seemed empty, but I couldn't be sure. Every now and then, the diner's flickering neon sign cast brief shadows across the lot. Each time it did, my stomach tightened, expecting to see them there, waiting. The sound of tires on gravel drew my attention. I turned to see headlights approaching, the beam cutting through the night like a lifeline. The police cruiser pulled into the lot, and the two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. My heart pounded as they walked toward the diner. The older officer pushed open the door, his boots echoing on the floor as he approached me. He didn't sit, just stood there with his arms crossed. "We didn't find anything," he said flatly. His voice carried a weight that made my stomach drop. "No car. No hitchhikers. Nothing." My mouth went dry. "But they were there," I insisted, my voice trembling. "I saw them. I swear." The younger officer gave me a look of pity, like he didn't know whether to believe me or dismiss me as tired and delusional. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it? Long drive, late at night, it happens." "I didn't imagine it," I snapped, louder than I intended. The man in the corner booth glanced over, his fork paused midair. The older officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, we'll keep an eye out. If anyone else reports anything, we'll follow up." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just sat there, feeling the weight of their skepticism settle over me like a heavy blanket. As they left the diner, I felt more alone than ever. The hitchhikers were still out there. I knew it. But now, it seemed like no one else believed me. I stared at the door long after the officers had gone, wondering what would happen the next time someone stopped on that lonely stretch of highway. I left the diner in a daze, stepping out into the chill of the night air. The cold seemed to seep through my jacket, making my skin prickle. The parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the trees. My car sat in the far corner, waiting for me. As I walked towards it, my mind raced with questions. How could they have disappeared like that? The officers didn't find anything, and yet I knew what I saw. I was sure of it. I reached my car and slid into the driver's seat, the warmth inside comforting for a moment. I locked the door instinctively, my eyes scanning the surroundings as if I expected someone, or something, to be watching from the shadows. I started the engine, the hum of it filling the silence, and slowly pulled out of the parking lot. The headlights cut through the darkness in front of me, the road stretching out like a ribbon in the void. As I drove, the unease settled deep in my chest, a heavy weight I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself that the police were right. There was nothing out there. It was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long, exhausting drive. But every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every flicker of light in the distance made my heart race, and every shadow on the road seemed to move, always just out of reach of my headlights. I tried to push the fear away, focusing on the road ahead. But my mind wouldn't stop. I kept seeing their faces, the hollow eyes of the woman, the strange stillness of the man. What did they want? Why were they out there, on that empty stretch of road, waiting for someone like me to pass by? Minutes stretched into hours, and I finally reached a point where I felt I couldn't keep driving anymore. I needed to rest. I pulled into a rest stop, the flickering lights overhead casting an eerie glow on the empty parking lot. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic on the highway. I parked near the back of the lot, far away from the few other cars scattered around. As I got out of the car, I glanced around nervously. The rest stop seemed deserted, but something felt wrong. The air was still, and the world seemed unnaturally quiet. I walked towards the building, my steps echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, greeted by the stale scent of old coffee and cleaning supplies. There was an attendant behind the counter, a thin, older man with gray hair and a weary look in his eyes. He didn't look up as I walked in, his attention focused on something behind the counter. I cleared my throat, but he still didn't acknowledge me. It was like I was invisible. "Excuse me," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "Can I use the bathroom?" He finally looked up, his eyes distant. "It's in the back," he muttered, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. I nodded and made my way to the bathroom, but as I walked, a cold feeling crept over me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like someone was watching me. The bathroom was small, the fluorescent light flickering overhead. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my chest as I did what I needed to do. But when I turned to leave, the door wouldn't open. I twisted the handle again, panic starting to rise in my throat. I pulled harder, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like someone was holding it shut from the other side. I backed away from the door, my breath quickening. What the hell was going on? I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the small bathroom. The air seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on me. I could feel the weight of someone, just out of sight, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, the door suddenly creaked open. I froze, my body tense with fear. But when I looked out into the rest stop, there was no one there. I stepped out cautiously, my eyes scanning the room. The attendant was gone. The room was empty. The entire place was empty. I turned quickly and ran out the door, my feet slamming against the pavement as I made my way back to the car. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing near my car were two figures. They were too far to see clearly, but I recognized them immediately, the woman with the hollow eyes and the man, standing unnaturally still. I froze in my tracks, my heart racing. How had they followed me here? How had they gotten ahead of me without me seeing them? I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my chest tightened with fear. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at the car as if they were waiting for me. Then, without warning, they started to move towards me, their steps slow and deliberate. My body jolted into motion, and I ran for the car, my hand fumbling for the keys in my pocket. I finally got the door open, slamming it shut behind me as I locked it in a panic. My breath came in shallow gasps as I started the engine and slammed my foot on the gas. I sped out of the parking lot, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see them following me. But the road was empty. The parking lot behind me was silent. I kept driving, faster and faster, not stopping until I reached the next town. My mind raced with questions, but the only answer that kept echoing in my head was the same one that had been there since I first saw them. They were waiting. They were still out there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that they would always be waiting.